Hi everyone, and welcome to Evidence Dialogues. Evidence Dialogues is a project established to provide an interdisciplinary forum for exchanges of ideas and information and to discuss issues and challenges in relation to evidence in different contexts, disciplines and areas of practice. I'm Yvonne McDermott Rees. I'm a professor of law at Swansea University, and I'm joined today by Professor David Lagnado, Professor of Cognitive and Decision Sciences at University College London. Welcome, Dave.
Greetings.
So, Dave, can you tell us a little bit about I know your background, your first degree was in philosophy. So tell us a wee bit about your interest in evidence. How did you come to become interested in evidence, and specifically how people reason about evidence and draw conclusions from the evidence before them?
Yeah, well, I had a relatively long journey from philosophy, maths and AI, and I ended up in a psychology department studying how people reason. And then I was enrolled I was hired on a really exciting project on evidence led by William Twining, Philip David, and also David Shulman was involved. And actually there were loads of experts in different disciplines: law, statistics, philosophy, history, intelligence analysis. So it's a really exciting time. And prior to that, I'd started working on how people reason under uncertainty, focusing on like the traditional heuristics and biases. And my plan was to apply these kind of concepts to legal and evidential reasoning. But I soon realized that the question of how people actually make sense of evidence was far more complicated and actually far more interesting. And I'm still trying to understand it, to be honest. And I also got really interested in the legal context, which was kind of fascinating because people have to make sense of a complex mass of evidence, and they often have to rely on their own common sense. They're not experts, like juries aren't experts, and they have to make these massively important decisions based on complex evidence. And so that was really interesting. And I was also pretty impressed that people actually to even get started and to draw inferences. So despite the complexity, people were able to actually kind of like make judgments. And even if those judgments were error prone, I was very impressed by the process of being able to actually kind of address those kinds of questions. And also during the same project, I was lucky to be introduced to formal tools such as Bayes nets and causal modeling. And that gives a kind of nice standard against which to appraise human inference, which was kind of missing, I think, for a while. And I also became convinced that causal models and evidence are integrally linked. And to make sense of evidence, we have to understand the causal processes that generate it. And I think this applies both to when we're looking from a legal perspective or a normative perspective, but also when we're trying to understand how people reason. And so I did focus on the legal domain, and the problems are challenging and really important. But I think that the same principles apply in everyday reasoning. And in a sense, we're always act as lay detectives in our own lives, trying to make sense of things.
Yeah, I think we can see those aspects really shine through in your new book, Explaining the Evidence, How the Mind Investigates the World. So like that core argument that in order to reason well, we need to understand the processes, and certain tools like Bayes nets and so forth can help with that. But I think we definitely also see the interest in the legal context shine through, because each chapter starts with an example basically that has maybe not a real life case, but yeah, has a legal sort of framing. So yeah, great. I mean, I love this book. I think it's really a tour de force and a must read for anyone who's interested in evidence. And in that, as I said, you argue that humans are, at our essence, we're causal thinkers. Can you explain a little bit what you mean by that?
Yeah, I mean, thanks for the compliments about the book. I'm pleased you read it. Hopefully that you add to my number. There's at least 2 or 3 people who've read it, so that's brilliant. Yeah, so in a way, when we think about human reasoning, there's a bit of a puzzle in a way, because on the one hand, people are extremely smart and do all kinds of intelligent things. And we have capacities for reasoning which go well beyond a supercomputer. But on the other hand, and sometimes in the same breath or at the same time, people struggle with quite basic probability problems. So this is a bit of a conundrum that people have wrestled with for a while. And I think one approach to answering this puzzle is to realize that people are geared towards generating explanations of the world, and they build internal mental models of the world to try and capture how things work. And this allows them to draw inferences and also to ask what-if questions and to explore counterfactuals. And the key thing is that these models are not just based in logical probability, or maybe they're not even based at all in logical probability, but they're based on our causal knowledge and our causal assumptions about how the world works. And that allows us to go beyond just statistics or logic and actually develop, meaningful models of how the world works. And just as an example, at the beginning of my book, I start with the case where a woman's body is found at the foot of a cliff. And then immediately you start speculating and generating causal explanations, like maybe she fell, or maybe she jumped, or maybe she was pushed. And then when we also think of prior causes of these possibilities, like, well, why would someone jump? Why might someone be pushed? And even causes of those causes. So we very kind of rapidly generate these causal stories, and often they're quite plausible. And as we get more information, as we maybe conduct further investigations, we update and expand our causal models, and we try and build explanations for the data we see. And so I think this applies to everyday reasoning, not just crime cases. So when you meet a friend and they're upset, and we try and generate possible explanations for why they might be upset, perhaps they've got problems at work or problems with their partner or whatever. And that helps us to probe further and maybe gather new evidence, and ideally to think of interventions to help. But despite this prowess that we have at building causal models, we do seem to struggle sometimes at evaluating these models against the data. And indeed, we often spin stories that seem plausible, but have very little grounding in evidence. And this is a great danger. And it's not surprising, because evaluating models can be very hard, and it adds an extra dimension of complexity, because we need to assess the strength and reliability of the evidence and how it speaks for or against various alternative models. But in a way, one of the key messages of the book is that causal thinking is fundamental to human cognition and how we reason, allowing us to predict and explain and trying to control the world. It's not just merely a shortcut, which is like the work of Kahneman and Tversky suggests that there's a causality heuristic, or it's like a shortcut. And I think that's wrong. I think actually it's the very fabric of how we think is by building these causal models.
That's really interesting. And when you talk about how our brains are designed to kind of come up, it relates kind of to the story model, doesn't it? The Pennington and Hastie thing, that you've got the prosecution case, and it's in your example, for example, it's the boyfriend was jealous, could it be him who's responsible for the body on the cliff? I'm often struck when we think about conspiracy theories and how everything sort of slots into a particular narrative really easily, whereas, as we know, reality is like messy and chaotic. And the same is true, I think, sometimes with some of the most well-known wrongful conviction cases. Sometimes it seems like these are just the most unlucky defendants in the world, because there's a series of things that you think, surely, the prosecution's explanation is the only way to explain these diverse things. I suppose, and that's something that troubles me a little bit, isn't it? That often the conspiracy theory or the prosecution narrative, it can be this neat, coherent thing that's narrative that seems more convincing than the messy reality that we all know is around us. So, any thoughts on how we can counter this, knowing what we know about causal reasoning and how the brain is sort of hardwired?
It's a great question, and in a way, I do think that we strive often for simple explanations in order to make sense of things, and we sometimes ignore the messy complexity of the real world. In a way, that's a strength too, because we couldn't track all the messy, chaotic nature of the world, and we have to kind of simplify. That's a great strength. But I think with that strength comes the dangers that we can oversimplify, and also because of our sophistication, I think, not just building models, but also maybe protecting them against adverse evidence as well. So there is that danger that when you have a kind of favored theory of what's going on, then you might be confronted with anomalous evidence, and you still have the capacity to come up with ad hoc explanations to protect your favored theory. And this is a danger. And I think conspiracy theorists are very adept at this, at adapting their theory in clever ways to kind of like preserve them against contrary evidence. So that's a real problem. And as I said, it's both a strength and a weakness. And I mean, in the book, I explore various tools or approaches, and as we might discuss, things like, being a bit more explicit and trying to model, or being a bit more explicit about your hypothesis and the evidence, and trying to weigh the evidence against alternative hypotheses. And so one thing I do advocate is these formal tools. I'm not saying that we always have to use them, but they do help you kind of articulate your reasons for or against different claims, and kind of force you to think of alternative explanations and to consider the strength of evidence and things like that. So even if we're not explicitly building Bayes nets, we should be very aware that any evidence admits of many alternative explanations, and we want to kind of try and evaluate the strength of those. And I think this also requires a certain kind of meta level reasoning. We need to kind of separate out what are the explanations or hypotheses, what's the evidence, and how the evidence might speak to those. And that's already an important meta level step in a way. We're going outside just purely building models, and we're also now switching to evaluating those models against the evidence. And I think that this is, I think formal tools and training can really help in this process, but I don't have the golden bullet to how to dissuade people of building conspiracy theories. And in a way, conspiracy theories is part of reasoning. It's not like it's some completely abhorrent thing that people do. It's like we try and build a sensible model of the world, and we try and protect that model against noisy data, so it's kind of like a strength and a weakness. It's like a double-edged sword in a way.
Yeah. And coming back to this point on because this is something that really shines through in your book, is this advocating for I guess what we might call them decision reasoning tools, or tools that decision makers might avail of, like Bayes nets in reaching decisions. Do you think are there particular problems that are particularly well suited to adopting these kind of formal tools? You mentioned, obviously, we draw inferences hundreds of times a day, so we can't do it for every single decision we have to make. But are there particular categories of decision or reasoning about evidence that lends itself really well to this kind of tool?
No, that's a great question. I think that I would like to think that we can use the tools in two ways. I mean, this is very broad, but in two ways. So the first way is when we have quite a well-defined problem or a well-defined kind of issue, let's say in a legal case, where we definitely need to reason probabilistically, and it might be a component of a larger case. So it could be the analysis of DNA or forensic evidence of some other sort, footwear or gunshot residue. And in the book, I cover quite a few of those examples where we really hone in on one particular component of a case, which might be the interpretation of some gunshot residue in the case of a Jill Dando, or it might be an interpretation of footwear evidence or DNA. And there, I think there's almost no doubt in my mind that using some kind of Bayes net tool is going to help you understand the probabilistic implications of the evidence and avoid errors that we know people fall foul of. And so I think that in that case, it's a very well-defined usage of the tool to promote consistent and logical reasoning, help us avoid errors. And just to note that we are all susceptible to these errors, whether you're a judge, juror, expert, we're all susceptible to these errors. It's probabilistic reasoning. So it's really great to have a tool that kind of like helps you. Okay, so that's kind of like an obvious case. But I think also, and this applies more broadly, it can be used as a thinking tool to help you understand and lay out the complex interrelations between hypothesis and evidence, even if you don't have precise numbers, even if you're incorporating things like multiple witness testimonies and other evidence and confessions and alibis. It allows you to map the interrelations, and often they are complex interrelations between different bits of evidence. And it kind of, so in a way, it kind of keeps you straight, and it forces you, and this is really important, it forces you to think of alternative explanations, to evaluate strength, even if it's not with a precise number, comparatively comparing the strength of different bits of evidence and considering reliability, and ideally helping you to combine those individual components into a more holistic judgment. So I think that even though the first example is, I have no doubt, that's where it should be used. In the second case, I think there's more, some people might have other tools that would fulfill a similar purpose. And I would just advocate that the causal modeling tools can do, operate well under just extremely quantitative probabilistic reasoning problems, but they can also operate, I think, pretty well under the more qualitative, messy problems that we encounter in other, in other parts of the case. But yeah, so I see kind of like at least two ways that it can be really useful.
I'm really glad you brought in that second example, because I think that's one of the objections we sometimes hear to this. It's like, okay, it works really well when we have some scientific probabilities that can be fed into the model, but it doesn't work well for cases where the evidence is more narrative in nature. It's person A said this and person B said that. And as you said, maybe it helps the decision maker to kind of pin their colors to the mast in a sense, because they have to think, well, what is the likelihood of this in feeding it into a model? So that's really interesting. I guess another objection we often hear, and here when I say we, I talk about, what I've heard of in the law context, but we often hear this objection in the legal context that judges and lawyers will never go for this because it's too time consuming, and that they'll see it as like an infringement on their professional role. Have you seen that kind of resistance in practice? I know you've done some work with police forces and things. And I suppose I'm interested to see whether those arguments come up in other disciplines outside of law, or maybe Bayes nets are used quite a lot in, I don't know, like medical decision making or in the clinical context. It's not really seen as this imposition on the decision maker's professional role.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think that, broadly, yes, I have seen resistance, and sometimes I've been quite surprised by resistance, not just in legal contexts, but also I was working in the context of intelligence analysis with US intelligence, and there was a huge, in a way, opposition to the use of Bayes nets and probabilistic reasoning more generally, and which I thought seemed pretty crazy to me. But and I've also seen its uptake in medical diagnostics in AI, but that's still very, it's only small pockets of that. So I think that there probably is resistance. But having said that, I mean, in the law, it's interesting. So even though there is kind of like commonly held resistance, I've actually chatted to quite senior legal experts, even judges who have been involved in cases where supposedly Bayesian approaches have been outlawed. I've actually chatted to judges who seem very sympathetic, and I think part of the concern is actually that they're worried that the tools might be too simplistic to capture the subtlety and nuances of expert human reasoning. And in a sense, they're right. I mean, the tools can't capture those complexities. So in a way, that's the part of the point of it being a tool. It's a tool to help you, okay, rather than to replace you. And so, yeah, in terms of encroaching on a professional role, or even encroaching on a layperson's role, I would see that the tool, is a support for judgment, and it helps you be more consistent, but and avoid information overload, and avoid, as I said, probabilistic errors. But again, it's not going to replace human judgment. It's just going to support it. And I think that's really important. Now, things like issues of time and resources, that is a real challenge. And because it can take time to get a proper kind of evaluation and do a Bayes net. And indeed, that was one of the reasons why in my work with the US intelligence, they seemed to there was an obstacle to adoption, I think partly because of the time and resources. But again, I mean, I think that's slightly missing the point. I mean, these tools don't have to be used like on the fly, live. They could also be used, and I think this is a really important role, as a training tool to help you become a better reasoner and to overcome probabilistic errors and think more, in a way, more deeply about the implications of evidence. So I see the idea of Bayes nets and these other tools as a kind of training to get you to recognize fallacious inferences and biases. And then once you have that training, I think you can use that much more readily in the field or in the wild. Okay. So I don't see that we need, it's just a straightforward objection that, oh, well, we don't have time to build a Bayes net. You might not have time to build a Bayes net in a rapid kind of like context, but you could have done your training before and been much more observant of common reasoning fallacies. And I really feel, I mean, myself included, that by laying out the Bayes net and thinking through possibilities, you really, I think, you can avoid a lot of, errors.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I think probably in the intelligence context, this argument comes up a lot that, oh, if we break it down too much, then we might sort of lose sight of the wood for the trees. Our intuition will be hampered somehow. And I always think, like, I'm not sure it's possible to break it down enough, and actually, if once you unpick the inferential steps that you've taken to reach a conclusion and you find there's a gap there and it doesn't support that conclusion, then surely that can only be a positive thing, right?
Yeah, completely. I mean, just thinking of an anecdote here, I was chatting once with a senior judge about how he decided cases in sentencing cases. And we were having a nice chat over dinner and stuff. And I was saying, well, what are the principles that you use? Or can we kind of like try and formalize the principles? I mean, I was quite naive. I thought and he said, oh, no. He was quite proud, saying, no, you couldn't formalize the principles. And I thought, hang on a second, should we be proud of the fact that we can't formalize or kind of like be explicit about the principles we're using? That's maybe not such a good thing. I mean, it might be that you have these intuitions that we just can't ever understand, but I think that's unlikely. I think we should be able to kind of like support intuitions with well-reasoned arguments, even if we use intuitions a lot. So yes, so that's just an anecdote, but I think it's quite representative.
Super interesting. Yeah. Dave, I wanted to end with, this is kind of slightly outside of the subject matter of your book, but I was really interested in one of your articles actually that you wrote with your excellent former PhD student, Dr. Alice Louthgreen. And so the experiment that you ran in this article was loosely based on the case of Sally Clark, who was as some viewers might be aware, this was a terrible miscarriage of justice where a mother was wrongfully convicted of killing her children. And in your study, you asked some participants to draw causal models using the online tool Loopy of the defense and the prosecution explanations of the evidence, while other participants were just asked evaluate the evidence without drawing those causal models. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think your main finding there was that the people who drew models, who used the tool Loopy, actually favoured the prosecution case, whereas those who just sort of evaluated the evidence without doing so favoured the more complex defence explanations. I was really surprised by this because being an advocate like you are for these models, I really thought, well, it helps us reach the right decision, right? And the right decision, as we know, is the defense explanation. She's not guilty. So yeah, I'm really interested to round it up really by some reflections on what we can learn from this study.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question, and you also read that paper, which I believe this is part of a program of ongoing work, to be honest. So we're just starting to try and unpick this and understand it. But just to quickly jump in on the point, I mean, we used the Sally Clark case as a kind of inspiration initially because it occurred to me that you could kind of model this in different ways. But the real case was just really complicated. There was huge amounts of evidence, not just medical evidence, but also evidence about all kinds of things to do with character and stuff like that. So we completely stripped out all those complexities and really boiled down in our experiment. It was literally, you just had 3 pieces of evidence, which could either be explained by a single cause or each piece of evidence needed a separate cause. So I don't think, even though we had inspiration from Sally Clark, I don't think it tells us anything about the Sally Clark case necessarily. I mean, we can speculate, but yeah. And as you said, what we found was that when people actually drew the model, they preferred if you like, the simple explanation where you have one cause explaining 3 pieces of evidence. Whereas when they hadn't drawn out the model and just kind of like were asked to discuss it, they seem to prefer the more complex, if you like, explanation where you have 3 independent causes. And even the word simple versus complex is a little bit loaded. But yeah, so we found that preference. And we also found, and this may be in a way more interesting, we also found that those people who drew the model, when they were asked to kind of like reason about the case, but they focused more in on probabilities and the fact that a single cause explaining 3 things was it. So they were kind of, in a way, the framing of how they thought about the evidence changed as a consequence of them drawing the model. Okay, so I don't want to kind of draw huge generalizations about preference for simple versus complex, because I think we could probably reverse that with other changes. But I do think it's what was really exciting in a way, and what we really want to understand is how the act of drawing the model changed people's judgments in some way. Whether for right or wrong, it changed it in some way. And I think that what we've done, some other separate work, is where we've had a bit more of a normative, if you like, ground truth about where there are some obvious probabilistic fallacies. And we have found that people drawing out the model does help them avoid those fallacies. But it's still a lot of, ongoing work to really understand what it was, or what it is about drawing out a model that's changed the way people thought. And we found it very robustly across many replications. So I know it's not just a freak result, but as I said, it definitely doesn't suggest that people would, implications for the Sally Clark case, I'm not so sure. But having said that, I do think that people might have been a bit persuaded in the Sally Clark case initially by the fact that the prosecution had quite a simple story to tell. It was like an evil mother murdering her children. It's a very simple story, whereas the defense had a much more complex story in a way. It almost seemed ad hoc. It was like each medical injury was explained by either post-mortem injuries or resuscitation attempts, so there wasn't a coherent kind of unified story for them to tell. And I think that probably did make a difference in the Sally Clark case. But I see that as separate in some ways from our studies where we get people to draw models. I mean, we'll see anyway. I'm excited to explore that in more detail.
Yeah, I think that's super interesting. It might be interesting as well to compare, is it something to do with even the software? Because if you look at how the prosecution explanation looks, it looks like a neat model. And is there something there that you say, oh, this intuitively attracts me more as an I don't know. It might be interesting to try with like some of the mock jury studies where we introduce sort of pen and paper diagrams, and let's see how that helps people.
Yeah, I'm really excited. I mean, always, in a way, this speaks to a bigger point in a way about how we externalize. So we don't just internalize our reasoning, we kind of use external tools. And obviously pen and paper is an amazing tool that we have to kind of externalize and draw things. And so I think that interaction between how we generate our own models and how we externalize information and interact with it, I think that is just like a fascinating area which we're yet to really understand or apply in a legal context. So I think that looking at the use of external representations combined with our own internal reasoning and how that helps or hinders our evaluation of cases, I mean, we should do that project.
Let's do that. That's a brilliant point to end on. Dave, thank you so much for your time. Thanks everyone for watching and listening in. There'll be more of these conversations within the series on our Evidence Dialogues site, evidencedialogues.wordpress.com. So stay tuned. Thank you.
Bye.